Good morning. Welcome to FRB Live. As the observant among you will see, I'm not at home today, and of course there is no advertising allowed on the FRB. But so bear with me, bear with us. Sorry if there's a little bit of background noise today. I had planned to be at home in the office, but I didn't quite make it. So good morning, guys. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good,
Um,
thanks.
So we're going to, first of all, we're going to talk about the session we had this week, diversity inclusion. We're then going to see what that does to our thoughts of responsible business and where that's going and what it means to companies as they go forward. And then we're going to have a quick look at AI because we've got an AI session this week, which we're all looking forward to. So first of all, guys, the discussion this week, diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion. What are your thoughts? Maria, perhaps I come to you first. What were your thoughts on that session? What came out of it for you?
So I think the biggest thing that came out of it was the deeper we go into this topic, the more. So for the first time, I hadn't been to a few of the sessions before, but for the first time, I started to hear about the challenge of well-being amongst employees and amongst groups that companies are expected to or trying to protect in some way. And also groups maybe that are getting a bit left behind, such as the sort of neurodiverse community. So the interesting thing for me was that we seemed to sort of touch on that for the first time, and that then took the conversation into through some slightly different lenses, which was actually less about groups and more about the challenge of how businesses are responding to individuals with varying mental and health and well-being requirements, and the challenge of trying to break that down to almost an individual level, really, because if you think about some of the groups, some of the minority groups that sort of traditionally exist within this ED&I space, they're protected by law, so that's the sort of start point. Some of them are also self-identifying. Some of them, companies actually kind of are not enabling self-identification of and sort of pushing other groups through a process, such as, I don't know, it's such as ADHD. You know, some companies say, well, prove it, sort of thing. So I came away thinking it's a bit of a mess at the moment, to be honest. But actually, at the heart of it, at the heart of this whole inclusion piece is about understanding people's well-being at an individual level, I thought.
Yeah, I agree entirely on that. It was interesting to get. We went into neurodiversity, then into well-being. It opened up the conversation to represent a much broader audience. I mean, as soon as you look at neurodiversity and then you look at well-being, all of a sudden you're talking about everybody potentially in the organization, not just groups. I also think it opened up some interesting dynamics around how do companies offer support, and where does that take them. I think Gary said from Turning Point that one of the things you can't afford to do is open up a topic and then not be able to deliver anything to help people. And I really felt that was interesting around ADHD. The companies sort of in error position themselves as the rescuer. Anyone that's familiar with the trauma triangle, they would position themselves as the rescuer, but that has problems, and pretty soon the victim was becoming the prosecutor, and the company was under pressure and being sort of prosecuted for not following through. So it's really difficult for companies to find their way into this, and I think it's right in the centre of what we're talking about by being a responsible company. You could say it's irresponsible to open the door on something and then not be able to not set the limits to what you can or can't do to support people.
But I think
So
at the
interesting
moment,
dynamic.
companies are opening the door to a lot of unforeseen or almost an abyss, really. A lot of unforeseen sort of and unintended consequences, and that's what I think companies are struggling to grapple with, because they're not able to simulate forward what might happen.
Yeah, I agree, and it's that pathway approach that we've been looking at. So many of the things that we're coming across now, companies need to sort of find their way forward, and they have to forward think. They can't just open a door on something. Stuart, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, likewise, but sort of to come at a slightly different angle, I guess. Yeah, when there's a physical illness or disability, we all know it's really easy to spot, understand, and then to as a business, as a leader, to compensate for, to make adjustments, to make things work. And obviously, when there's a mental illness, that should be equally the case. But it's not necessarily as easy to identify and know and spot. Some of it, as Maria said, could be self-diagnosed and discussed, which makes it very overt. But often that's not the case, and therefore, it is harder. But then, then to push that even further, neurodiversity does not mean illness. Someone could be diverse in their thinking, but completely sane and able. It's just they think differently, they process differently. And the value to businesses around some of this ED&I is actually in that diversity of thought. And therefore, the question then is, how do you or should you compensate for that diversity of thought? It's not an illness, but if you want to get the best out of someone, how do you flex the role to play to someone's strength? And again, a good leader will sort of probably naturally do this, but at its extreme, it means that there is no one role that's the same to the next. If we all think differently, process differently, have different strengths and weaknesses, then potentially, your level of adjustment to allow people to be at their best is at the absolute extreme, right? And I guess one of the observations we also had, and this joins the two together, is we know that actually resilience is individual resilience is a big issue today. We also know that as there's a drive to trying to satisfy people much more at an individual level rather than a collective level, you're seeing a greater increase in actually individual accountability because the individual has to step up to the plate on that. And again, I guess the hypothesis or the question even is that increase in individual accountability partly the reason why we're seeing a decline in individual resilience, right? And I think it's an interesting thing for us to debate in one of the future sessions.
I certainly agree. The role of leadership is changing, as you said, and I think we're going to debate that next time. Personal resilience is I think a huge issue, and I think people's resilience changes. If anyone's under pressure from any direction and it gets too much for them, then their resilience goes down. As we know, it's happened to all of us, I'm sure, at some point during our lives. So that resilience angle is really important. It also connects more easily into the financial returns on this sort of work. And I think resilience and what people can contribute to a company and the return on investment started to come into the equation a lot easier as a natural part of that debate than it does with some of the other topics in diversity. So I think there's a lot more to discuss there. I think we're going to talk about leadership next time round, and I think that will be interesting to explore. On top of that, and I think why we got to that is a lot of people are running the hypothesis that the generations entering into the workforce are less resilient. Now, that's still to be proven, but it is a concern for a lot of organisations that younger people coming into businesses now are less resilient. Now, whether that is just that they will move work and roles quicker or easier, or as Maria was saying, they come in with their personal brand, which they're aware of and don't want to have a negative effect on. It'll be interesting to see. It will be interesting to see. What do you think, guys, it does for our general thoughts on the future of responsible business? What does it add into those thoughts, Maria?
Well, I suppose for me, I mean, a lot of the conversation that we had, I kept coming back to, so where does the responsibility lie to take some action, to do something about it? And I do wonder, with a workforce coming in, whether there is an expectation that the company, the employer, should be the responsible party to the fixer of the problem, or whether the individual should be the fixer of the problem. And I think that's a really interesting spectrum, or could be a really interesting spectrum for us to try and see where that responsibility lands across various industries, markets, and sort of employee demographics.
Yeah,
We don't have an answer for that yet,
no,
but
it's
there is
interesting.
a spectrum there, definitely.
And it's interesting that seems to be playing out in wider society as well, especially around subjects like ADHD, etc. Whose responsibility is it to fix it? And somebody pointed out, I think it might have been you, Maria, that people are getting a lot of support and help at school and in further education. They expect that to be there when they arrive into the business world,
Yeah.
which is adding another. I'm not saying it's not wrong. I'm all for supporting people, but the dynamic there is really interesting. I think also it's getting more and more towards the personalization. It's how do you look at responsibility from an individual's perspective, their responsibilities, but also what should they be responsible for, and what's your responsibility to that individual, which I guess, Stuart, feeds into your favourite theme, one of them, which is about treating people as individuals.
It's always been a theme for me. I mean, I worked for two businesses where respect was at the heart of the business, and actually, if you try and really understand what respect is, it is all about individuality and appreciation of individuality. Yeah, because if you ever were growing up with which I was, you should treat others the way you would want to be treated. Then that whole philosophy is completely flawed, because if you really believe that, then you think everyone is like you, they want the same things as you, they have the same preferences as you, right? So and of course you need to treat others the way they want to be treated. You need to switch off and decenter, switch off what you want, and that's at the heart of respect and individuality. And I think there is so much in just that last minute of conversation, that if people really get and understand, the world would be a complete and utterly different place. It really would be, and therefore it's been a core construct that I've used as part of a professional coach since 2003, and in business ever since, right? And I think it does pop up in our conversations, and again we get back to leadership because of it. It seems that is a core theme across all of this. Responsibility doesn't work if one person's responsible and everyone else isn't, right? And it doesn't work if one part of your business is responsible, or you're responsible to one of your stakeholders, your shareholder, but not to your customers, your employees. And it only works, of course, when it all works, right? And therefore, you've got to think about this collective responsibility as a set of leaders in a business around how you impact everybody. And as we've been talking in our exploration sessions, we're picking on little subjects that are interesting, little subjects in their own right, but actually the art of this is making sure the whole thing joins up, right? And I think that's where we need to join the whole thing up.
Yeah, I agree. Uh, uh, Going alongside leadership, as I often say, is followship. There's also responsibilities as a follower of that leader, and we're starting to get these two different sides of the coin. For me, what's becoming more and more apparent as we go through is how difficult it is to think ahead, to plan, to find your way forward, and that's what I think is one of the constant themes in all the discussions we have. Is we're at a point of really significant social, technology, technical change, and just a general awareness. So plotting a way forward is becoming more and more difficult. Um, and I think companies need some flexibility in that. We heard this week there were some examples of people setting off on a path and not really thinking or understanding what may happen further down the road. One of the companies was saying they offered a test for ADHD, they would fund it. They didn't anticipate, and quite like, why would you? How many people? How many people would want to do that? And B, the consequences of a lot of people understanding that for the first time that they're a little different. And then you need something in place to help those people. So on all the subjects we go to, whether AI or trying to think about the future of customer and how customers are changing in this world as well, it's how do you plot that path forward, knowing that the real world's going to keep getting in the way. And every time we have this conversation, it becomes complex and difficult if we're not careful, because um, we don't quite know how everything's going to play out. I feel the world was simpler 20 years ago when I was running a sales force, etc., etc. It was a bit more predictable, perhaps, than it is now. What are your thoughts on that, Maria? Because you're very much somebody that enjoys that sort of chaos, that unpredictable world. That's a compliment, by the way. That unpredictable. It seems to be where you're happiest. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I am pretty happy in that kind of world, actually. And I mean, my whole working life has been um,
Chaos, yeah.
chaos, pretty much, and trying to sort of make sense of the chaos. And it's funny, I was talking with someone about my time um, back at ASOS this week, and trying to explain to them from a sort of customer experience role perspective how different things were back then. And I was telling them about the time that when I was at ASOS and we launched social media for customer care, right? So this would have been late 2007, early 2008. And retailers nobody really had done this before, but we were seeing customers asking questions, interacting with their own personal queries at this point. And there was no technology. The Hootsuite hadn't even been invented at this point. And but we knew that we had to sort of be on there. We had to do something about it. And where I was getting to was the idea that we didn't really have frameworks at that point. It was very much a kind of bootstrapped era of making the best of what you had. And a lot of it was about placing bets, placing bets against the risk of, so trying to simulate certain scenarios the best you could to be able to say, well, and what it would have boiled down to really was, is it a bet for or against your stakeholders? For or against your existing customer base, for or against your new customer base, for or against the employees. And you had to try and sort of balance your way through making it for the decision for the most people, the most amount of stakeholders that you could.
And that's really, sorry to interrupt you, Maria, but that's really interesting you saying that, because that's exactly what a lot of large organizations don't like. They don't like moving into that risky environment.
But everything was unknown. Taking the choice to move to free returns, first fashion retailer to do that was unknown. There was no data or no frameworks or case studies that would have support that. But what you were talking about at that time was trying to get to first mover advantage. So you were trying to create enough space between you and the competition at that point in time to be able to have the advantage over the customer base, and that's because the trajectory was all about growth at that point. And so in terms of responsibility, I've sort of gone a bit off track, but in terms of like the idea of where we're at with responsibility is we've sort of moved from that bootstrap phase into this more industrial phase now, where we have all the frameworks we could possibly want, we have all the data we could possibly want, but what do we do about it? We outsource it to consultants to analyze and make recommendations. We outsource it to a CX team that sits somewhere festering in the corner to kind of tell us what to do, or we outsource it to an NPS score, and we live off it. Our strategy becomes about just increasing that score. Perhaps I'm giving quite stark examples, but that's, I think, with responsibility, that's what we've got to move away from. And Stuart's point about balancing the stakeholders is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you're underselling yourself a little bit there, because a lot of the things that you sort of forward projected into worked really well. So there's also something about that ability to look at the horizon, closer, near horizon, and make good judgment calls and say that's where we need to go. And that's probably where a lot of organisations are right now on a lot of these subjects. Stuart, you know, with First Direct and Atom Bank, you've played in that territory as well, where, or I shouldn't say play, but you've worked in that territory and made the right choices. And so it's there's something in there, isn't there, about choosing that way forward and plotting a way forward into something that maybe feels a bit unknown.
Yeah, I wouldn't over glamorize that though as well. Yeah, we made as many bad choices as we've made good, right? Yeah, and you know the old IDEO saying is you fail fast, succeed sooner, right? So as long as you're on it and you're looking at it and you're responding, you know, making a decision and then thinking, no, that was a bad decision, and scuppering it and changing it to something else is absolutely part of the makeup, right? And I think that will be here to stay, right? I think that if you want to innovate, you will make mistakes, and that's okay. Yeah, you need to give yourself some slack, right? As long as you can spot that it's not working and it's not going to work on the mid to longer term, and you can react and respond and you know, pivot as necessary to make it work. And I think that's where that responsible leadership is. Responsibility doesn't mean not taking risks. Absolutely, you need to take risks, but it's absolutely making sure that they're calculated, it's eyes wide open, and you're constantly assessing stuff to then pivot.
And you've got a path to disposal, you know, that's really clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember what some of the guys back in the day at O2, they were saying about some of their products, that they needed to have a pathway that was clear when the product was no longer relevant and they could get rid of it. And a lot of people weren't planning that. And so planning your exit from some of these strategies is just as important, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really yeah, I think that's what we're getting from all these conversations so far, that things are evolving, and it's how you find your way into some of these areas that are a little uncomfortable, have some element of risk to them, but that's better than sort of stumbling into them or being forced into by regulation. So talking of areas that are big and scary and we need to find our way into, the next session we're having on Tuesday is about AI. And we're talking about the different things we can do with AI. We might be having a bit of a focus on some of the possibilities for employees and people and that sort of stuff. But Stuart, what are your thoughts as you go into AI conversation?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to take a slightly different tack, aren't we, on this one? So previous conversations on IA is about how we do IA, you know, the ethics, the morals, the practicalities, data, all the usual things to to drive whatever the content is, whatever the business is needing. Doesn't matter. It was about the how you do it, right? This next session, we're going to actually look at the what we do. But what we do is, again, trying to join all these themes together, focused on employee engagement and well-being. And again, it's a classic use case, I think, these things for AI, because there's no magic formula today that says, if you do this and you add this and you take away this and you times it by this, you're going to get better engagement, and to this level, right? We all know the sorts of things, and it's well researched, the sorts of things, again, aligned, I guess, to Maslow hierarchy of needs in one form or another. What employees need at all sorts of different, whether that's an extrinsic factor or an intrinsic or altruistic, doesn't matter. There's a whole gambit of stuff you can do, but there's no magic formula. And same on well-being, especially on mental illness, stress, pressure, for example, which is a massive burden on individuals and businesses. The right level of pressure is a good thing, right? But the right level of pressure for me might be a completely different level of pressure for that Maria can handle, right? She can handle probably damn sight more than I can. And therefore understanding how you could use AI to simulate all of those data inputs to drive either better engagement or better well-being, I think is a fascinating topic. I'm not sure that I've seen much out there of people doing this. There's point solutions on things, but to try and see how you could take this massive data to drive a better engaged workforce, better from a well-being perspective, I think this would be a fascinating thing to discuss, and that's the debate.
Excellent.
Next week.
I've seen some potential things potentially coming into the market, which are designed to help. One of them is something that can gauge anxiety real time by your interactions with your phone, and that may be good, it may be bad, it may be frightening, but it could be useful data to understand what's making one person anxious, because as you say, I might be able to take pressure in one direction where Maria takes it in a different direction. You may have something else, and that's just, we understand that as human beings, don't we? So all those complexities, it seems to me that AI has a role in it, but we need to find out what it is and why it is. What are your thoughts on that, Maria, on that debate? You looking
I
forward
think
to it, or you're going to jump ship and say it's not for me?
I'm hugely looking forward to it. I've been tracking for the last 15 years this movement called the quantified self, which is all about sort of like the codification of humans, right? And how data can support.
I can't believe, Maria, I've let you get back into this one of codification of human beings.
Yeah.
Where are we going?
Where are we going with it?
I've opened the door on this one for you, haven't I?
I've got such mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, and everybody does the quantified self these days to a certain degree, right? If you've got a smartwatch, if you've got a Fitbit, you're kind of doing it a little bit, tracking your steps, tracking your heartbeat, tracking your health, that sort of thing. So these days it's a lot more mainstream than it was 15 years ago. But there is a lot more that can be done. Tracking it. We could be live on this call, and each of us could, potentially have a little monitor up here looking at our stress levels, or and that might be something that we all start to display in 10 years' time, just as part of who we are. Who knows where it's going to go? It scares me a lot, because there's part of me that it feels incredibly inorganic in a sense, but in another way, the data, in order for AI to help humans, it requires data. It requires the ability for it to codify things, codify humans. So yeah, it's a whole minefield. I'm really excited to get into it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. I mean, who has the output? That's the thing that usually comes in.
Yes.
Who's the data for?
Who's responsible?
Who's responsible? And what's the actions? Like Stuart, I coach people, and if I could actually have some output reading of what actually stressed the people I'm trying to work with, as opposed to what they think stresses them, it would be so insightful. I mean, there'd be subjects that jump out at you that